We now want to show you how to make some very quick bunting, ideal for any celebrations, weddings, birthdays, and it's using the Vlieseline Quickscreen Triangle and just scraps of fabric. Now sometimes the Vlieseline Quickscreen Triangle can be a little bit daunting when you look at it. You can make your flags any size you like, but this particular one is using 8 lines of the Vlieseline Quickscreen Triangle, and then I've created an equilateral triangle from that. Now what happens is all of the sewing is done on the solid blue lines and your fabric actually goes on the unprinted side. And as I say, sometimes you can get a little bit confused about flipping, so there's no reason why you can't get your crayons out or your felt pens and do a little bit of colouring in. So you can see here I've marked the first one, and this is where the fabric's going to go on the other side, remember, the centre or the point of my bunting triangle. And then it's very simply a stitch and flip process. So number 1 goes on this side, then number 2, then number 3, then number 4, 5, 6 and 7 on this side, 8, 9 and 10 on this side. It's very simple. The main thing to remember is that we're having to stitch up to these points, but I will remind you. But it's certainly a good idea to have this just to use as a reference. For the fabrics, you're simply going to use scraps of fabrics. These are just 1-inch strips, which are more than enough to fill that area. So it's a perfect scrap buster. So what I've done is I've very quickly numbered these pieces here. Now the first area that we're going to cover is the bottom of the bunting triangle, which is this diamond area on here. So you need to cut a piece of fabric that's large enough to cover that. That isn't quite so. It is foundation. It is a technique called foundation piecing, and sometimes it's best not to be too mean with your fabrics. Now remember, the fabric goes on the plain side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop the fabric over there. And the Quickscreen Triangle is see-through, so you can actually see that I've more than adequately covered. I think I was a little bit too generous there, but sometimes it's easier to be too generous than less generous. Now pop a pin in just to secure it. The next piece of fabric is going on this side here, which is number 1 on the chart, and you can always refer to the chart. Now for the bunting, I just did one colour one side and one colour the other, and this is just the way I do it. It's my tip. Place your next strip beside you with the right side facing up. Put your fingers where your fabric is going to start and to stop, and pop your triangle with the Quickscreen Triangle close to the top of the strip. You need at least 3 pins for this project, and it's worth checking at every part. Pop a pin on what would be the sewing line there, and I'll just pop another pin on the sewing line this side. So I know that is my sewing line. I know that's the end of my sewing line here. If you turn it over, you can see that I haven't quite got that in. And I'm going to keep the mistake in that I've just made because I do think it's important for you to see it. So can you see now the pin is definitely within my fabric. Now you don't have to worry about your 1/4 inch seam allowance on this. You can go quite scant. You are going to reduce your stitch length on your sewing machine. So can you see now I've got the pins. This is the end of the stitch line on here. And when I turn it over, it's easily in the fabric. Now the next thing to check is if you flip this fabric over as if you'd stitched it. There is a lot of flipping of your fabric backwards and forwards, and just get another pin and just check. You can either hold it up to the light, but you can check that your fabric is within that area that you need to cover. And once you've done that, take that pin out, flip the fabric back on itself, and if you change the direction of these pins, it'll just make it easier for sewing. And we're now going to stitch from this point here to this point here, And as I say, you can always refer back to the chart that I've got for you. So, talked about my stitch length. You need to decrease the stitch length. I often take mine down to 1.8. It could be a 1.5 on your sewing machine. I will say it's always worth checking, because having that reduced stitch length means it can be a little bit more difficult to unpick. But it just gives a nice, neat finish. Now, the Quickscreen Triangle is not being removed. It's staying in. So I'm going to cut that thread off there. Take that last pin out and take it out of the machine. So can you see here, you don't have to use a red thread obviously, but I have stitched along there. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this excess fabric off, because if I didn't, as I flip this over, the bunting or whatever the project that you're doing would become too thick, and yeah, it just wouldn't give you a nice finish. So the easiest way to do that is, and I do everything at the sewing machine here, fold the triangle back on itself. The reason I'm saying that is because I have frequently cut this triangle off when I used to start. So if you have the triangle folded away, and then with a pair of scissors, of course, you could use, there are 1/4 inch, they're called add a quarter rulers, or you could use your rotary cutter and your standard ruler, or you could just eyeball it, cut away the excess fabric. When you're cutting the excess fabric, never go around the corner, always cut in the direction that you've just sewn. Once you've done that, you can open it up. You can finger press, or alternatively, you can use a finger presser tool, or you could use your standard iron. So we have the first piece on. We're going to flip this over, and we're now going to go on the opposite side of our diamond, but this time we're going to sew up here. So we need to cover this area. So remember what I said earlier on, get into the habit of popping your strip so it's lying horizontal in front of you. And this doesn't matter whether you're right or left-handed, this is a really good way to ensure you get this covered. I'm going to get rid of that extra thread there. Pop your fingers on the line. So this is the line we're going to sew. This is the stitch line. Pop your fingers at the beginning and the end of that stitch line. Turn the piece that you're working with and pop it close to the upper edge of that strip. Now you don't need to pre-cut the strips, and I would recommend that you didn't. And the reason being is that quite often what can happen is when it's on a 45-degree angle, you can cut it and it's too short. Remember, for this one, I recommend at least 3 pins. Pop 2 pins in on what would be your seam line, your stitch line. We're then going to flip it over, and you can see the pins are within my fabric, so I'm happy. I know I'm going to hit it. I'm still not tempted to cut any of this length off at this moment in time. We're going to turn it back over, and I'm just going to move that starting pin out the way. Pop it underneath the sewing machine, and we're simply going to stitch along that line again. I'm going to take this pin out because I've got the head going in the wrong direction. We don't want to sew over it. So we're just going to sew. Now that's where the stitch line ended before. Don't be tempted to stop there, because remember, when you stitch that line, you open the fabric up to the next line. So we need to go 1 up. You'll soon know if you haven't, because you'll turn it over and you'll just have to pop it back in and stitch again. Take it out the sewing machine. And still don't be tempted just to trim anything off. Remember, fold the triangle paper back on yourself. Have it so it's away, you're not going to cut into it. And this time we're going to cut up here. So I'm going to cut up approximately 1/4 inch seam allowance up there. Now I know that my fabric isn't going to go past this point here, so I can chop a little bit off just to make life easier. And what I'm now going to do is press that open like that. I'm now ready to put the next one on, which is number 3 on the chart, so it's going on this side. So I've coloured it in just to make life easier, and we're going to be stitching along this line here. Pop your next strip horizontally in front of you. Put your fingers where your stitching is going to go, and make sure that that goes to the top of that strip. Remember, you need 3 pins. Pop a pin near the end there. Pop a pin at this end here. Just make sure we're in. And then turn it over and check that it's in. Now, can you see here? It's just in. So I may just move that strip up a little bit just to make life easier, because we don't want any gaps. So I've just moved it up. Pop the pin back in. Now remember that if you're not sure and you're just starting off, you've got your pins in where your stitch line is, flip that over. And to be fair, you can actually see through the Quickscreen Triangle, so you can see that you've covered it. Failing that, hold it up to a light or use a pin as a guide. I'm quite happy that I've covered that. So I'm going to flip that back over there, turn it over, pop it underneath, remove that pin, and I'm going to stitch along. Now remember, that's the end of the stitch line, but we're going to go 1 up because that's the width of the fabric, and then we can stop. We're taking this out, and I've got a little bit of extra fabric here. Fold your triangle, so the triangle is sitting on the left-hand side if you're right-handed, and on the other side if you are left-handed, because what we don't want to do is cut away any of that triangle paper. Turn that over and press it. And then we're going to carry on adding the next strips on. So once you've completed all of your strips, and as I say, you can make this as big or as small as you want, just turn it. I'm just turning this through the right side. I've just gone slightly ahead. Pop some fabric so it's right sides together with your triangle bunting, and stitch around. Once you've stitched around, you can see I've used pink and scissors just to trim away any excess fabric. Turn it through. Poke out that lovely bottom point, and then there is your triangle bunting, first one made. Make as many bunting triangles as you wish, and I'm going to show you a very quick method how to create a hanging strip using the Vlieseline waist shaper. So to create a nice neat hanging, you could use the Vlieseline waist shaper. The Vlieseline waist shaper is fusible on one side, and it has these fabulous perforated lines here which make folding so easy. To adhere it to your fabric, cut the length that you require, get a damp cloth and press it for between 8 and 10 seconds. Now, like all the Vlieseline fusible products, after you've fused it, then it's advisable to leave it for approximately 20 to 30 minutes, and that allows the glue to adhere correctly to the fabric. If you want any more information with regards to the Vlieseline waist shaper, then please check out the video. Now you have 2 options. You could have pre-cut your fabric to the size of the waist shaper, but quite often I just do what I've just done there and then trim it down. And you can just use the edge of the waist shaper as a guide. Now I appreciate that I haven't left this for 20 to 30 minutes, but for demonstration purposes, I'm sure it'll be fine. Now the perforated lines here are what you're going to fold up, and you can give this a quick press. Do the same on the other side. and give it a quick press. And then fold it in half. Once you've done that and you've created your bunting triangles, then simply pop your bunting triangle into there and top stitch it down. You could always add a button or a loop at the end for hanging. If you didn't want to use the waist shaper, of course, you could use ribbon or tape. As you can see, Vlieseline has a wide range of products, each with different properties and benefits for your projects. You can view the whole range on the Vlieseline website, where you can download the brochure, which has detailed information on all of the products across our 4 categories. You can also join the conversation with us on our Facebook page, Creative Community Group and Instagram. All of the details are below.